Maya MacGuineas. Maya serves as the president of the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. As a leading budget expert and a political independent, she has worked closely with members of both parties and serves as a trusted resource on Capitol Hill. Maya testifies regularly before Congress, has published broadly across numerous outlets, and appears regularly as a commentator on television. We're so honored to have her with us today to help us understand the current state of the nation's fiscal health.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great to be with everybody today. Thanks for joining, and thanks for having me on the panel. I'm basically going to set the stage on the overall fiscal picture, which healthcare is a huge component of, and then turn it over to folks who are going to go dig much deeper into the actual healthcare issues. So let me just start with the fact that, as you can tell from the title of this presentation, deficits everywhere. The fiscal picture is bleak. We are not in a situation where we are headed towards any kind of a sustainable fiscal situation in the foreseeable future. And many changes are going to have to take place in order to set the fiscal health of the country back on track. That's going to include healthcare reforms, and that's going to include a lot of other reforms. Okay, so first slide, please. One of the first things that we knew was, listen, there are times when you should borrow and there are times when you should not borrow. So a group like ours, Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, isn't at all against using debt. It's against using debt for the wrong reasons or for not economic reasons. So there are many times when we have to, for emergencies, borrow. Obviously, COVID was one of those times. And borrow we did. It was the right thing to do. We borrowed upwards of $5 to $6 trillion, and that kept the economy from tanking when basically we are slamming the economy shut. But once your economy is strong and recovered again, you don't want to be borrowing nearly as much. But as you can see from this picture, we still are on a track where we have an upwards trajectory that is going to be continuing to grow. The deficit's going to be continuing to grow through these years based on structural issues. So it's not that we're borrowing for emergencies, it's that we have a situation where our healthcare costs are growing, our retirement costs are growing, interest on the national debt is growing, and revenues are not coming anywhere close to keeping up with those spending commitments. It's interesting, if you look at the numbers for this year, we're actually, where it's in 2023, where it's saying $1.5 trillion, we're gonna see a deficit that's larger than that. We now know that. And if you take some accounting gimmicks out, not gimmicks, the way that we scored student debt forgiveness, it's actually going to have grown almost double from 1 trillion in 2022, which would be the number not looking at the student debt effects, which the Supreme Court struck down, into about 2 trillion in 2023. The point being, we're seeing very, very large growth in our budget deficits. We're going to continue to see that for years going forward. Next slide, please. Just like the deficit is the amount that you borrow each year and is problematic, this ends up contributing to growing levels of national debt. Now, the national debt right now, which is just under 100% of GDP, is actually approaching the highest level that it's ever been. The last time the record of our national debt was 106%, and it was right after World War II. Makes sense? We fought a world war, and we actually brought that debt as a share of GDP back down very quickly in the subsequent years. Through economic growth, cutting spending, revenues went up, and so we came back down to much more sustainable levels. Historically, our debt has been around 50% of GDP. So we are now twice that level, and within just a few years, we're going to break that level that we hit right after World War II, with the dubious distinction of that we are doing it without having been through a world war. Again, this comes from not just borrowing during emergencies. We borrowed a lot during COVID, we borrowed a lot during the Great Recession, as we should have, but we also are now into a period where we are routinely borrowing significant amounts in between those emergencies when the economy is strong and there's no economic justification for all of that borrowing. If you look then going forward, you can see that the growth of the debt is going to increase even more. Many of these, of course, long-term projections are difficult to make. We don't know what the underlying economic conditions will be, but this assumes that there is not a big recession, which there quite possibly could. It assumes that interest rates don't go up particularly much higher than they already are, and that could happen. Assumes that there aren't other emergencies, which, judging from the past years, there almost certainly will be. So it's quite likely that these overall debt to GDP numbers, are actually underestimating what the overall situation could look like. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Not just deficits and debt are not the only problematic things, but we also are facing major trust fund insolvencies in some of our biggest programs. Most programs don't have associated trust funds. The ones that do are financed in a way where benefits are paid out from those trust funds. We have a highway trust fund, which is going to be insolvent in 2028. We have Medicare Part A hospital insurance going to be insolvent in 2031. If we don't make changes, you have provider or benefit cuts of over 10% across the board. And most troubling probably is the Social Security system facing insolvency in 2033, when today's 56-year-olds are starting to retire. Many young retirees will just be old retirees. What will happen then? Across the board, 23% benefit cuts, affecting everybody regardless of need. To me, this one, not just because I wrote my graduate thesis a long time ago about how to fix Social Security, but this one is just unconscionable. We've known about these problems for so long. We've known that we don't have the money to pay for all the promised benefits. And the sooner that we had made changes, and the window of really making the smartest changes has already shut, but the sooner you make changes, the more able you are to pass them, to spread them out gradually over time and truly protect people who depend on the programs or aren't in a situation to have their payroll taxes raised. But because we've waited so long, we're really going to be stuck making some very difficult choices when it comes to how to fix the problem. That's true of all of these. When you know you're facing insolvency, you should take steps immediately. There's actually legislation that I think is great legislation out there, something called the Trust Act. It is bipartisan and bicameral, which is very unusual. The heads in the Senate are Senator Manchin and Senator Romney. But it basically says if there's a trust fund that is going to be insolvent within the next 15 years, you should appoint a special task force that will focus on what you might do to fix those programs. And so that'll be 15 years in advance. Longer would even be better. But it's sort of, in my mind, nothing to object to that. It's just saying if you know there's a problem, we should start thinking about it and put some energy into how to fix it. There's no parameters on what you can or can't do. For some reason, I will never understand. You have various organizations opposing trying to fix programs once they're becoming insolvent. In my mind, as long as it's an unbiased structural approach saying we've got to do something instead of nothing, that's just a no-brainer what Congress should be doing. And so I favor looking at these trust funds as quickly as possible, because the longer we wait, the more difficult those solutions become. On to the next slide, please. Now, starting to talk a little bit about some of these issues. The big issue, and everybody knows that our budget has got discretionary spending divided between domestic, discretionary, and defense, but the big areas of spending are in our mandatory spending. And within there, Social Security, healthcare programs, and interest payments are the biggest areas of spending, and they are clearly where the biggest areas of growth are. So over the next decade, nominal spending growth, it explains, these areas explain 87% of all spending growth, hugely driven by retirement, aging, retirement, healthcare, and now interest payments, which are contributing to this much more than they were before, because we borrowed so much over the past years, including when times were good. And now with interest rates going up, that means interest payments are growing very, very quickly. Next slide, please. The other part of the budget ledger, of course, is revenues. And over time, our revenues are predicted to grow to pass their historical average. You can see where they are down at 16.8 right now. They're going to be growing looking forward. But right now, revenues are pretty low. We actually had a boom right after COVID because the stock market had done so well, including crypto, and there was a higher level of revenues. But this is all normalizing now. Revenues do grow on their own because of the way the tax code works, so they will continue to grow, but spending will grow much, much more quickly. Next slide, please. So when you have a debt situation like this, it starts to put huge pressure on interest payments. And right now, interest is the single fastest growing part of the budget. For quite some time, it was healthcare, but you now have interest growing faster than all other parts of the budget. We right now spend more on interest payments than we spend on all spending for children at the federal through the federal government. Within 4 years, we will be spending more on interest payments than we do on national defense. It is just clearly not a good use of those resources that could be spent, whether you're a small government, cut taxes, or a big government, expand government programs. Interest payments have the first claim on the overall federal budget, and they are going to be claiming an increasing amount as time goes on. Next slide, please. This is interestingly, it's a policy problem, but we know how to fix these things. Unfortunately, we've waited so long that all the fixes have become much more difficult. There are a couple no-brainers. Everything has to be on the table. Anybody who says, I promise not to touch taxes, doesn't understand how much spending cuts it would take. It's just not possible or credible to do this on the spending side alone. Anybody who says, I promise not to touch our biggest entitlement program, Social Security and Medicare, you can't get this budget structurally balanced without addressing the problems. And as we just went over, due to the insolvency challenges, you have to fix them so that the programs can be structurally sound and we can be promising things that we will actually keep. But instead, if you look at this slide, I find this so depressing. It really looks at all the times that we have borrowed versus all of the times that we have saved. And you can see there is a big propensity towards borrowing. We're actually going to launch something in a month or two, which is just a debt thermometer, which is going to check every year how much we oversaw the debt increasing. So how many new policies added in 10-year numbers, what they added to the national debt. I think that'll be really helpful and interesting to track, because I'm not sure lawmakers understand how many of the legislation, the pieces of legislation that they passed all added to the debt. By the way, no judgment on the policies. We're all going to have different policy preferences. I will say a number of these policies are things that I found very important spending or investments to make. I thought tax reform was a really important idea, but I wouldn't have done it as tax cuts. And I thought there were some really important spending ideas, but I would have offset the costs. So none of this is about the judgment of the quality of the policy. It's whether you choose to pay for it or not. And as you can see from here, we almost never choose to pay for our policies fully and increase and in fact reduce borrowing. We tend to debt finance the vast majority of the time. Next slide, please. This is just a little precursor. We're going to talk about this more with the next two great panelists, but the healthcare costs are a major driver of the deficits. I know they are coming down. This is terrific news. We all just saw that news and a very powerful article on it, but they are still growing. They're still projected to grow in a way that is faster than the economy, and anything that's growing faster than the economy is thereby squeezing out other things. So we'll take a deeper dive on that in just a moment. And then last slide, please. I just want to end with, because we'll be hearing a lot, I hope, about ways to reduce the deficit, but I also just want to make sure we have a realistic sense of what's doable, because sometimes people talk about balancing the budget. I was talking with a member of Congress yesterday who wanted to balance the budget in 5 years. It's not going to happen. Like, we are so structurally out of balance right now. I think we need to be reasonable in what fiscal targets we go after. So as I think about that, and we think about the presidential campaign and what people might work on, it seems that maybe at this point, merely stabilizing the debt at or below 100% of GDP, which would require just under $6 trillion in savings over the next decade, probably is about the most we could hope to do. I mean, you got to keep in mind that the debt ceiling deal that we just had saved $1 to $2 trillion. That was only looking at a small portion of the budget, but it was the easiest portion, and that was just spending caps. No one had to be particular about what policies they were enacting. This stuff is hard. Raising taxes and cutting spending is hard. We have to do it, but if you put a target out there that's so excessive, double digits, I just think politically it's not viable. So I think small or medium, or actually they're pretty big steps, but not huge steps are more likely to be politically successful. And I will end by just saying, as I look at the fiscal situation we're in now, we're entering a presidential race where I'm worried there'll be a competition between candidates to see who can do the least in fixing some of these big structural problems in terms of entitlements and the need for taxes. I think it's probably time to think about a fiscal commission like we had 10 years ago with Simpson Bowles. And granted, the fiscal situation wasn't as bad then. The political situation was better, and it still wasn't able to be enacted. But I think probably the best chance of hope is a fiscal commission where members and experts are really able to steep themselves in the issue, learn about the problems, learn about the values of their people from other parties and different perspectives, and try to come up with a compromise plan that is helpful in insulating some of the sitting members of Congress from the tough choices that we absolutely know we need to confront, but right now we haven't seen the political will to do so. So with that, I will turn it over to the next panelist. Thank you so much.